Ride the mercury tide, a fluid and ever-changing flow of information and emotion that defines our modern existence. Dive into these silver stories that shift and evolve as we search for the absolute truth. Hit subscribe now and follow the flow of our unique cinematic art today.
The hardest part wasn't sitting at that table while my stepmother laughed at me. It was knowing exactly how much I'd transferred into my father's account the week before, $47,000, and keeping my face completely neutral while she called me a financial burden to the entire family. It was the Saturday before Thanksgiving. My father had insisted on this dinner, all of us together at the house in Naperville where I'd grown up, the house he'd moved into with her 8 years ago after my mother passed. She'd redecorated everything. The curtains my mother had picked out were gone. The kitchen table was different. Even the smell was different. Some cedar candle she kept burning that I'd come to associate involuntarily with the specific feeling of not belonging somewhere you used to call home. My brother was there too. He's 4 years older than me. Always has been the one my father bragged about at neighborhood barbecues. Went to DePaul on a partial scholarship, dropped out after 2 semesters, spent most of his 20s cycling through ideas he described as investment opportunities that required startup money he never paid back. He was 34 now and still had the energy of someone perpetually on the verge of a breakthrough. I was 29. My name is not important to this story in the way names usually are. What matters is what they thought of me, and what I actually was, and the distance between those two things. I worked in food product development, had since I was 24 when I took a junior position at a mid-size company outside Chicago that specialized in formulating products for grocery chains. I'd been promoted 3 times. 2 years ago, I'd co-founded a consulting firm on the side with a colleague named Petra. No, I need to stop. I've already used her name in a previous story I told. My colleague's name was Don Kowalski, who grew up in Kenosha and had a laugh like a car struggling to start in January, and who was the only person outside of my accountant who knew the full picture of what I'd been doing for my father. What I'd been doing was this. For 2.5 years, I had been making the quarterly payments on my father's home equity line of credit. Not the mortgage itself, that was paid off, but the HELOC he'd taken out 6 years ago when the contracting business he and my stepmother ran together hit a rough patch. The balance when I first discovered it was $162,000. He'd been making minimum payments. The interest was compounding. I'd run the numbers on a Tuesday night in my apartment, sitting at my kitchen island with a glass of water and a hollow feeling in my chest, and understood clearly that if nothing changed, they would spend the next 20 years barely treading water. So I called my father's lender and set up a third-party payment arrangement. I named it after my consulting firm's LLC, which had a deliberately generic name, Lakewood Strategic Solutions, that told you nothing about who owned it. I told my father I'd handled something administrative with the account. He thanked me without asking what I meant, which told me everything I needed to know about how much he wanted to understand the specifics. My stepmother, I was certain, had no idea. At dinner that November Saturday, she was on her second glass of Merlot when my brother started talking about his latest thing, a logistics app, something about last-mile delivery for small retailers. He was describing the TAM, the total addressable market, with the confidence of someone who had looked that phrase up recently. My father was nodding. My stepmother was smiling at him in the way she always smiled at him, the way that had never once been directed at me. I was quiet. I'd learned to be quiet at that table. I ate the green bean casserole she'd made. It was good, actually, I'll give her that. And I listened, and I kept my phone face down next to my plate the way you're supposed to at family dinners. Then she said it. She'd been talking about the business, their contracting business, how it was finally finding its footing again, how they were thinking of hiring 2 new crew members in the spring. And then she turned to my brother and said, almost as an aside, "At least one of you knows how to manage money," and looked at me with a smile that wasn't really a smile, and added, "We worry about you, sweetheart. We really do. Your father and I were just saying, at some point you have to stop floating and build something real." My brother laughed a little. Not cruelly, exactly. More like he'd accepted this version of reality and was comfortable inside it. I looked at my plate. My phone buzzed. I ignored it. It buzzed again. My father said, "Maybe put that away for dinner," in the tone he used when he was trying to smooth something over without addressing what had caused it. I flicked the phone over and saw the sender. It was an automated notification from the payment portal I used for the HELOC account. Quarterly confirmation. I'd set it up to send to my personal email, but I'd also, months ago, added a secondary contact for documentation purposes, my accountant's office. Something had changed in the portal's settings and the confirmation had routed to a new number as a text. Dawn had seen it by accident when I'd given her my phone to look something up at the office 2 weeks before, and she'd said quietly, "Does your dad know?" And I'd said, "No." And she'd looked at me for a long moment and then handed the phone back. Now the notification was sitting on the screen in front of me, payment of $11,750 confirmed. Lakewood Strategic Solutions. Account holder. My father's name. Outstanding balance, $38,200. I turned the phone back over quickly. My stepmother had seen it. She had the angle. She had that particular alertness people get when they sense something has just changed in a room. "What was that?" she asked. "Nothing." It looked like a bank notification. "It's work. On a Saturday." My brother had stopped talking about the logistics app. My father was looking between us the way he always looked between us when tension arrived, like a man hoping very much to be somewhere else. I said I needed to step outside for a minute. I said it was cold, and I grabbed my jacket from the hook by the back door anyway, because I needed the walk to the end of the driveway and the feeling of November air and 20 seconds where nobody was watching me figure out what came next. I stood on the cracked concrete at the edge of the garage and I looked at the notification again. 23 months of payments, $11,750 a quarter. The original balance had been $162,000 when I started. It was down to $38,200 now. Another 3 or 4 quarters and it would be gone. And they thought I was floating. I went back inside. My stepmother was standing in the kitchen doorway with her arms crossed. My brother had gone quiet in a way that meant he was interested. My father was still at the table, looking at his plate. She said, "I think you should explain what you're managing on behalf of your father." I said, "I don't think this is the time." She said, "I think it is." I looked at my father. He was looking at his hands. I said, "Dad, did you tell her?" He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "I mentioned there was an arrangement." "What arrangement?" my stepmother asked. Her voice had sharpened. This was not a woman who liked surprises in the household finances. She ran the books for the contracting business. She tracked every receipt. "What arrangement have I not been told about?" I sat back down at the table. I put my phone face up in front of me. I said, 2.5 years ago, your HELOC was at $162,000. You were making minimum payments. At the rate you were going, you'd be paying on it until Dad was in his mid-70s. I set up a payment plan through my business to accelerate the payoff. The current balance is $38,200. It will be retired in full by next fall. The silence that followed was one of those silences that seems to have physical weight. My brother was very still. My stepmother's face had gone through several things and landed on something I couldn't immediately name. My father said softly, "I thought it was better not to make a big thing of it." "You knew," she said, and the way she said it told me that whatever anger was coming, the first of it was going to land on him, not on me. "I knew there was help," he said. I didn't ask for details. That was the most honest thing he'd said in years. He hadn't asked for details because he'd understood, on some level, that the details would require him to reckon with something he wasn't ready to reckon with. My stepmother turned back to me. "How much have you paid in total?" "About $124,000. My brother made a sound. Not words, just a sound. She said, "That's not possible." I pulled up the payment history on my phone and slid it across the table to her. 23 rows. Dates, amounts, confirmation numbers. She scrolled through it slowly. My father did not look at the screen. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Your salary, I have a consulting practice," I said. "It does well, I don't spend a lot. You live in a 1-bedroom apartment in Pilsen. I chose that apartment. I like that neighborhood. I'm not living small because I have to. I'm living the way I want to." She put the phone down. She sat down. For a moment she looked like she didn't know what to do with her hands. My brother said, "Why didn't you say anything?" I looked at him. When would I have said it? At which dinner? In which conversation? Where I was described as not building anything real? He didn't have an answer for that. He had the grace, at least, to look uncomfortable. "I need some air," my stepmother said, and got up and went to the back door, the same one I'd used 20 minutes earlier, and stood outside for a while. My father and I sat at the table. My brother poured himself more water. Nobody spoke. When she came back in, her face was different. The sharpness was gone. She looked tired and a little smaller, and she sat down and looked directly at me for what felt like the first time all evening. She said, "Why?" I thought about that for a moment. "Because he's my father," I said. "And because watching a problem compound when you have the ability to stop it is something I'm not capable of doing. It's not how I'm wired. But She stopped. Started again. "I haven't been kind to you." "No," I said. "You haven't." Another silence. "I assumed things about you," she said. "That weren't fair." "You assumed the same things everyone in this family assumed," I said. "That I was the version of me that existed at 21, when I was in fact figuring things out. I kept figuring, nobody checked." My father looked up then. He had the expression of someone who had been avoiding a mirror for a long time and had just been handed one. He said I should have checked. "Yes," I said. He said, "I'm sorry, sweetheart. It wasn't a grand speech. It wasn't the kind of apology you'd hear in a movie." It was quiet and a little awkward, and he was looking at the tablecloth when he said it, and it was entirely real, and it hit me somewhere under my sternum in a way I wasn't prepared for. I drove home that night on I-290 with the radio off, thinking about what Dawn had said to me back in September when I told her the full story of the HELOC, the payments, the dinners where I smiled and said nothing. She'd said, "You know you don't get credit for sacrifices you make in secret, right?" She'd meant it practically. She meant that I was building resentment without building understanding, that keeping silent wasn't noble, it was just lonely. She wasn't wrong. But I hadn't known how to do anything differently until the phone buzzed at the wrong moment, and my stepmother saw the screen and the question got asked for me by accident. 3 days later, on the Tuesday before Thanksgiving, my father called me. He called me, which he almost never did. He texted mostly, short practical texts about logistics and weather and the occasional news article. I was at my desk when his name came up on my phone. I closed my laptop and answered. He asked how the drive home had been. Then he said he'd been thinking, and he wanted to understand more about the consulting practice, what we actually did, how I built it. I told him. He listened without interrupting, which was something he had not done consistently when I was younger. I told him about the niche we'd carved out, food manufacturers going through reformulations who needed someone to manage regulatory compliance and consumer research simultaneously, a thing that was more complicated than it sounded and that a lot of firms handled badly. I told him about the hospital food service contract we'd just signed in October, our first institutional client. I told him that Dawn and I had turned down an acquisition offer in the spring because the terms weren't right and we believed the business was worth more than they'd offered. "They tried to buy you out," he said. "Yes." A pause, and you said no. We said not yet. He laughed a little. "I didn't know any of this." "I know. Why didn't you tell me?" I thought about how to answer that honestly without it becoming an accusation, because the conversation was going somewhere careful and I didn't want to wreck it. I said, "I tried a few times. Early on. You'd change the subject or bring up something your brother was working on and I'd let it go. Eventually, I stopped bringing it up." "That's on both of us, I think." He was quiet for a moment. "Then it's mostly on me." I didn't argue. "I want to understand it better," he said. "What you do, who you are now. I feel like I've been operating off old information." "You have been," I said. And I said it without heat, just as a fact, because it was one. "Can we do dinner? Just the two of us, before the holidays get complicated." I said yes. We went to a Thai place in Oak Park that he'd never been to and I'd been going to for years. He ordered Pad See Ew and asked me real questions and listened to the answers. He told me he'd been scared when my mother died, that he was going to get everything wrong, that he'd leaned too hard on my brother because he understood my brother in a way he didn't understand me, and that he told himself I was fine because it was easier than admitting he didn't know how to reach me. It was not a complete repair. One dinner doesn't do that. But it was the beginning of something that hadn't existed before, a version of him and me that was built on what was actually true rather than what was convenient to assume. My stepmother texted me a week later. Short, direct, which is her way. I looked up Lakewood Strategic Solutions. I found the press release about the hospital contract. I'm sorry I underestimated you. I'd like to start over if you're willing. I sat with that text for a day before I answered. Then I said, I'm willing. My brother was the last and the most complicated. He called me in December, late on a Wednesday, and he wasn't drunk, but he had the energy of someone who'd been sitting with something uncomfortable for long enough that it had started to itch. He said, I keep thinking about what you said, about which dinner would have been the right one to say something. I said, yeah. He said, I didn't make it easy. I said no. He was quiet for a second. Ben, I think I made it easy for them to not see you, because if they were looking at your failures, they weren't looking at mine. That surprised me. It was more self-aware than I'd expected. I told him so. He said, I've been in therapy for 6 weeks. Turns out I have a lot to work on. I laughed and he laughed, and for a few minutes we sounded like two people who had grown up in the same house and remembered some of the same things and might, with enough time and effort, figure out how to be in each other's lives in a way that actually worked. The HELOC will be paid off in August. I've already decided that I won't tell anyone when it happens. I'll let the account close quietly, the way it was always meant to. That was never about being seen or acknowledged. That was about a problem that needed solving, and my having the ability to solve it. What I want to be seen for is the work, the real thing. The company that Dawn and I built in her spare room on nights and weekends, the clients we earned, the offer we turned down because we knew we were worth more. I want to be seen for who I actually am, not the version they invented when they weren't paying attention, and not the version who silently carried the weight for 2.5 years without asking for anything back. Both of those people existed. But only one of them is still standing, and she's just getting started. I used to think that doing the right thing would eventually be recognized, that if I kept my head down and kept building and kept showing up, even for people who didn't particularly care whether I showed up, something would eventually shift, that the truth had a way of surfacing on its own. What I didn't understand is that the truth doesn't surface on its own. It surfaces when something cracks, a buzzing phone at the wrong moment, a number on a screen that someone else wasn't supposed to see. You don't get to control the timing. You only get to control who you are when it happens. I think about what it took to make those payments for 2.5 years without saying a word. People sometimes frame that kind of thing as noble, and I don't think it was, exactly. It was more like, I saw a problem, I had the means to fix it, and not fixing it would have meant watching my father lose something while I did nothing. That's not nobility, that's just the way my conscience is wired. I couldn't live with the alternative, so I didn't choose it. But here's what I've come to understand about the years I spent being quiet in that house, eating dinners where I was described as someone who hadn't figured it out yet. Staying silent wasn't protecting anyone. It was protecting a version of me that didn't actually exist anymore. The girl who was still figuring things out at 21 had long since become someone else. I just hadn't made them look. Dawn told me once that competence without visibility is just a private achievement. She meant it as practical advice. She was talking about business, about not underselling what we built, but it applies to everything. You can be the most capable person in the room and still let people treat you like you aren't, if you never give them the information they need to see you accurately. That's not humility. That's just letting the wrong story stand. What I've learned, and I mean really learned, not in a bumper sticker way, is that integrity without courage is incomplete. It's not enough to do the right thing quietly. At some point you have to be willing to be seen doing it. Not for the applause, not for the apology, though the apology matters, but because the people who love you deserve to know who you actually are, and you deserve to be known. My brother is in therapy now. My father asks real questions. My stepmother sent me a text that took real effort to write. None of that happens if a payment notification doesn't buzz at the dinner table on a Saturday in November. None of it happens if I don't stop making myself small to keep the peace. The HELOC closes in August, quietly, the way it was always meant to. That part was never about being seen. But I am, finally. And that part, the being seen, turns out to matter more than I let myself believe it did.